throughout the Middle Ages, when Europe was shaped by ties of dependency, oaths of allegiance, and the rigid structure of the most common image associated with peasants is that of silent submission. Popular narrative often portrays them as resigned figures, taking hard work, paying fees, and living under the absolute control of feudal lords. However, this view is a simplification that disregards the countless forms of resistance, revolts, escapes, and mobilizations that have profoundly marked European history. The so-called peasant revolution was not a single event, but a series of movements that over centuries revealed the constant tension between oppression and the desire for freedom within the feudal system. To understand how these men and women, seemingly so earthbound, dared to challenge the established power, it is necessary to delve into the mechanisms of servitude, the occasions when patience ran out, and the crucial moments when freedom became a cry impossible to ignore. As feudalism took hold between the 9th and 13th centuries, serfs became an essential part of the rural economy. They were responsible for cultivating the land, maintaining infrastructure, sustaining agricultural production, and ensuring the survival of the fief. In return, they received military protection and the right to use plots of land for their subsistence. This balance, however, was far from stable. Increased obligations, the introduction of new taxes, constant wars, and increasing pressure on agricultural production made servile life increasingly difficult. Although the serf was not a slave, he possessed rights, family, property, and certain legal guarantees of impossibility of leaving the fief, and a strong dependence on the lordship found limits in human patience. History is marked by countless episodes in which this patience was broken. What has been called the peasant revolution does not refer to a single insurrection, but to a continuous movement of resistance, which took different forms according to the time and the territory. In some cases, the resistance was discreet, hiding part of the harvest, allying with neighboring villagers, postponing mandatory deliveries, sabotaging projects, or even clandestinely migrating to distant cities. In others, it took on dramatic dimensions: armed revolts, burning of manorial archives, occupation of castles, kidnapping of administrators, destruction of charters, and open attempts to abolish feudal obligations. Each of these actions, however isolated it may seem, represented a step towards the construction of an ideal of freedom that would grow strongly at the end of the Middle Ages. One of the first elements that fostered the ideals of freedom among the serfs was the growth of cities. With the flourishing of trade, the increase in the circulation of coins, and the emergence of regional markets, many peasants began to glimpse possibilities beyond rural work. Cities offered opportunities for social advancement, skilled trades, and, in many cases, the chance to gain legal freedom after a certain period of residence. The famous German expression "city air brings freedom" symbolizes this process. Runaway serfs, by settling in urban areas, could escape seigneurial control as long as they managed to survive the period required by local laws. This encouraged silent but profound migratory flows, causing significant losses to the fiefdoms and weakening the system of serfdom. At the same time, the European economic scenario has undergone radical transformations. The Black Death in the 14th century decimated a large part of the population, creating an intense labor crisis. With fewer workers available, serfs gained bargaining power, demanded better conditions, and rejected traditional obligations. Feudal lords, desperate to maintain agricultural production, tried to increase the demands on the survivors, creating a tension that would culminate in devastating revolts. The most famous of these, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, became a symbol of a class that, tired of exploitation and lack of perspective, decided to unite against the aristocracy, led by figures such as Wat Tyler, and fueled by radical religious discourses that advocated equality and justice. Thousands of peasants marched towards London. Although the movement was suppressed, its impact deeply shook the English feudal system and left lasting marks on legislation and public perception of serfs. In France, the scenario was not much different. During the 100 Years' War, the devastation caused by armies, looting, and mounting taxes made life in the countryside almost unbearable. In 1358, the Jacquerie broke out, a violent revolt marked by the destruction of castles and direct attacks on the nobility. French peasants, desperate for misery and constant violence, brutally expressed their rejection of a system that seemed to exploit their last strength. Though suppressed with extreme ferocity, Jacquerie revealed that servile submission had clear limits and that, in extreme situations, the rural population was willing to confront even the armies of the aristocracy. As in England, the revolt did not destroy feudalism, but accelerated its transformation, reducing obligations, reducing taxes, and encouraging new labor relations. In other regions, peasant resistance took less violent but equally significant forms. In Italian villages, communities of serfs pressured masters to negotiate fairer rates. In parts of Germany, peasant leagues organized to protect collective rights. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista created opportunities for social mobility, allowing serfs to obtain land in newly conquered regions. These movements, although fragmented, reveal that the struggle for freedom was not an isolated or episodic phenomenon, but an integral part of feudal history. It is essential to understand that the peasant revolution was not only about explicit revolts, but also about the gradual evolution of the rural mentality as new ideas circulated, whether through itinerant preachers, merchants, or religious intellectual serfs, began to question the legitimacy of servitude. The concept of freedom, although still far from the modern ideal, began to be debated as a real possibility. Sermons on human dignity, spiritual equality, and divine justice often fueled dreams of change. Some priests took a stand on the side of the serfs, criticizing seigneurial abuses and advocating land redistribution. The gospel, interpreted in a radical way by certain religious groups, became an instrument of political contestation. Over the centuries, this slow construction of collective consciousness has had permanent effects. Feudal lords realized that maintaining a rigid system was economically unfeasible and politically risky. The increasing monetization of the economy transformed rural labor, allowing many menial obligations to be converted into cash payments, which weakened the foundations of service. Urbanization has consolidated alternative options for the rural population. The formation of national armies reduced the military importance of the feudal knight, diminishing the autonomy of the lords and strengthening the central power of the king. Gradually, the very social structure that sustained feudalism began to dissolve. The idea of freedom, therefore, did not arise suddenly. It was planted, nurtured, and defended during centuries of peasant resistance, although serfdom persisted in some regions until the 19th century. Its erosion began much earlier, driven by movements that questioned the established order. The peasants' revolution was not victorious in the sense of destroying feudalism immediately, but it won in the historical sense. Over generations, the serfs undermined the system from within, provoking reforms, renegotiations, and transformations that would pave the way for modern society. Today, when looking back, it is possible to see that these men and women, often ignored by traditional historiography, were silent protagonists of change. They faced violence, hunger, persecution, threats, and yet they continued to fight for something they believed was possible: a less oppressive future. His legacy is not only in the records of great revolts, but in the daily persistence, in the small victories, in the altered course of history. The peasant struggle for freedom was not only a social revolt, it was a civilizing process that contributed decisively to the fall of feudalism and to the rise of new forms of life, economy, and social organization. The peasant revolution, therefore, should not be seen only as a set of violent episodes, but as a historical force that transformed Europe in silence, step by step, generation after generation. The fiefdom, once rigid and seemingly indestructible, gave way to the persistent desire for freedom, dignity, and autonomy. Thus, to understand these revolts is also to understand the formation of the modern world, born not only of palaces and courts, but of the calloused hands of those who dared, even without weapons or titles, to challenge the imposed order and dream of a different future.